So morning, everyone. Just an official welcome from the Parnell Business Association. My name is Cheryl Adamson. I'm the GM of the association. And it's lovely to welcome our members as well as those of you who signed up via our Facebook and Eventbrite invite. It's lovely to see some new people. So I'm going to hand over to Joey, who's going to introduce Jerome. And we aim for this to normally be about 45 minutes with questions at the end. So over to you, Joey.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. Tēnā koutou katoa, co-Josephine Tokuingoa, co-Parnell Business Association Board. So as Cheryl says, we're delighted to bring this webinar to you this morning. Reducing carbon emissions in buildings is really vital. Obviously, we're not going to achieve any of our commitments, the Paris commitments and New Zealand's commitments, if we don't tackle the built environment. Globally, buildings represent 39% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the building, the construction, the materials, and operations. So it's really essential this is an area that we tackle. Building floor space is due to increase massively, so it's projected to double by 2060. And there's only which is a 3% investment in new construction, which is being green. So there isn't a huge amount of green finance currently going into the construction sector, building sector. So, and renovation rates for buildings is only 1%, so it's really low. In New Zealand, buildings represent 20% of the country's emissions, which is significant. And we know that in the last decade, emissions from this area, from construction and buildings, has grown by 66%. So we're going the wrong way. So it's really important that we look at what we do, because we're really locking in high emission buildings for the future, and that isn't what we want. New Zealand's a real issue with really poor quality housing, as we know, and that really affects people's health. And it's estimated that respiratory diseases are set to cost the government nearly $6 billion a year. So we really need to tackle the buildings. So green buildings obviously can be good for people and good for the environment. So it's a great to be able to bring you today. New Zealand's really leading expert in this area, and I've known Jerome for about 12 years, so I'm really excited. So I'm going to read Jerome's bio out to you, and you'll be really impressed, and you'll see where I'm saying he's New Zealand's leading expert. So Jerome, his knowledge spans high performance, sustainable and adaptive reuse of building design, healthy material specification, use of eco-technologies, regenerative development, and a whole systems approach. Jerome is the associate principal at Jasmax. Sorry, can we mute everybody? Thank you.
I can do it, you can.
So as I say, Jerome is at Jasmax. He's the associate principal and he leads the green team. And he's also a founding member of the Carbon Working Group at Jasmax. Jerome has recently been working with the Ministry of Health to develop an action plan for future health infrastructure, including establishing critical actions, performance metrics, upgrading design processes. These measures will ensure that the future health of projects meet obligations of the New Zealand government's carbon legislation, but at the same time, as I've mentioned, about really upholding the well-being of all users. The plan includes establishing a bicultural and sustainability design requirements, including a Green Star 5-star rated, the International Living Framework, core framework, use of life cycle analysis for the whole of life carbon reporting, and adoption of integrated design and processes for cost delivery and increased asset value. Jerome is a New Zealand Green Building Council's accredited professional, and Jerome's able to offer clients advice not just on support and advice around Green Star certification, but also many of the other leading sustainable design tools. Jerome recently gained a Living Future accreditation with the International Living Future Institute and has played active roles in community and industry education for over 20 years. Is a long-time advocate for design process and outcomes that help communities thrive and ensure that our ecosystems are healthy too. So, kia ora, Jerome, and welcome. And we will take questions at the end of Jerome's presentation. So I'll hand over to you, Jerome.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks for having me today. And thank you, Joey, for the fabulous introduction. And just to say, yeah, buildings, they're a really big part of our world. And there are many, many issues. I'm glad to say that the industry, you could probably say we've turned a bit of a corner, like we're not building just the lowest of the low quality and sort of being unconscious. The industry really has picked up in the last few years. That's good. And I will share my PowerPoint and let me know if that's working okay. Can you all see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay, we'll crack on. There are lots of issues, and I'm only going to cover a few of them today, but hopefully it's enough to sort of give you some sense of, well, yeah, let's just get going, eh? So, press. So, I've adopted this whakatoki, tuhia ki te rangi, tuhia ki te whenua, tuhia ki te ngako o ngā tangata, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, ti hei moriora. What I like about it, it really talks to the quality of our relationships. You know, our relationship with the land, the sky, the sea, and also with each other through that sort of high principle of love. And it also talks to the fact that the underlying purpose, the sort of the driver of this planet is a life system. We're unique. We're unlike any other place in this universe. And we have this ecosystem that's been hanging around for 3.8 billion years. And I'm looking at, you know, 30, 35, 40 outcomes of that ecosystem, people, for instance. So it's an interesting one. We are on a bit of a journey, and the last 30, 40 years, the last 150 years, we've been very industrialized. We've moved towards what I would call a more mechanical or linear mindset. And in the last 30 years, we've really, as a global society, we have encouraged, if you like, the maximization of profit and corporate role over many other important drivers. And a living system is a whole living system. It optimizes, it doesn't maximize. And so these crises that we face as an opportunity to really think about how our communities work, how our democracies work. And buildings are a really good intervention point into that kind of thinking. So I'm going to run through a couple of the challenges. I'm sure you'll be familiar with them, but they are pretty stark. And then we'll talk through the approach to success in terms of some building projects and things like that. And I'm going to give you a little taster of some systems thinking about how we might actually return to the source, return to how we can live and play and work in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our countries, on this planet, in a way that will sustain us. So, Jasmax, I'm sure many of you know about us. We're pretty large, over 200 people. We have architects, urban designers, interiors, landscape, and we also have some brand teams. And we've been on this journey really since we were founded over 55 years ago. The M of Jasmax with Ivan Mersip, and he was the lead architect on a building that I'm going to talk about a lot today. He died in 2014 at the age of 83 at his drawing board. And now we're really looking intensely at carbon, but also carbon in the context of how we have a systemic response to the challenges we face. So I keep updating this slide. We just at the beginning, you know, just under 2 years ago, Australia was having the worst bushfires ever. And and billions of wild animals and hundreds of millions of hectares of land were burnt. There were evacuations, respiratory problems from smoke, etc. And recently, Australia lifted its temperature sort of weather, its weather forecast temperature map, and included another 5 degrees that went from 50 to 55 degrees. All over the planet, places are burning as the impacts of climate change are real and affecting our ecosystems and our cities through things like heat island effect. Older people are much more vulnerable to that. And then when it's not heating up and drying out, my God, it's raining. And we saw the floods in Europe just a few months back, which were just literally unbelievable. And that's the result of a destabilized climate. So we really want to, we have fingers crossed that COP in Glasgow will deliver a global agreement and real action behind that agreement. There is a lot of smoke and mirrors out there around this. People really do not want to detach from fossil fuels. And that is a challenge because actually we're quite similar. We have a pretty high per capita footprint of carbon in New Zealand. And I was thinking the other day about our city, and we often think places are a long way to walk or to cycle. And I realized that it's because we drive most of the time. And when you drive, it's so quick. Whereas when you walk, it's maybe 5 times, 6 times that length. So we have to reimagine how we're going to live in our city and try out, get on the bus occasionally and try it out. It might not be as bad as we think. So the challenge is that we know we're facing climate change, and Kyoto was 1990, so that was 30 years ago. And one would have thought that this graph would be going in the opposite direction, that actually after Kyoto, people would get serious and carbon emissions would start trending downwards. In actual fact, the opposite has happened. The last 30 years has seen globally the release of 50% of the total extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the last 200 years, since 1790. That's not good. And when you scan up from the 2050s, so date along the bottom and temperature on the left-hand column, when you scan up from 2050, on the 10-year trend, we're heading for 2.5 degrees of warming. That is way out of everybody's comfort zone. So we've really, and I don't want to overemphasize that, individually we can make a very small difference. And sometimes as business leaders and drivers, we can make a much, much bigger difference. But actually, we need our governments to get real about, our energy grids and process energy, and places like Australia stop digging up that coal, etc. So there's some pretty big existential threats, and there's some pretty big challenges to business as usual that we have to engage with. At the same time, we're seeing increased strandings in whales, massive extinctions of insects through the use of pesticides and monoculture farming, inappropriate land development. And it's not just, we do need to build houses in our city, but we don't need to cover the whole place with tarmac for roads and concrete for driveways and extra garages. And we need to retain those permeable areas. But quite often we're building on high quality productive land. That's Tamaki Makaurau is one of the most productive and fertile areas of the whole of New Zealand. Toxicity, massive release of chemicals into the environment, causing many of our health problems, especially cancers, and a lot of plastics have hormone disruptors in them that leak out into the ecosystem and into our lives. There's a lot of social inequality. The housing crisis in Auckland is really, really bad, and it keeps getting, we're just starting to see some changes around build to rent, and players like Kahukura getting serious. And really impressively, that's a government department, and they're doing much greener homes. They're really rapidly investigating low carbon buildings. And so we're going to see, just in the nick of time, 10,000 homes built over the next 5 years that really will be healthier to live in and have a lower carbon footprint, which is excellent. But just our food footprint as well, it's pretty carbon rich. There's a lot of wastage. So all these things are connected, And it's not just a matter of carbon, it's a matter of biodiversity, it's a matter of our relationships with the planet and the places that we live in. And there's a question there about how much do we care for our neighbors, our communities, and the places that we live in. And those questions start to help us understand how we might evolve and change. This is California Country Club and California Beach in late 1950s. You didn't want to go to the beach and get stung by a mosquito. So what did you do? You got DDT, an organophosphate pesticide, and you sprayed the bejesus out of everything. And it didn't matter that you were running around, in your togs, getting coated and stuff. This is an extreme example, but there are many thousands of toxic chemicals out there, many of them used in the building industry. And this is part of our underlying systemic health degradation, if you like. In the last 30 years, sperm counts in men has halved due to the release of sort of like mimicking endocrine disruptors or additives in plastics that mimic female hormones. So we have a range of options in front of us. I call this the trajectory of sustainable design. So on the left, conventional, that's the building code. That's our stop ourselves going to jail. That's the buildings don't fall down in earthquakes. And people who use wheelchairs can get into our buildings. That's basic compliance. And then we can do a lot better than that pretty rapidly. And that's what we call sort of green. And there are a growing number of green buildings in New Zealand. In fact, Jasmax has delivered about 20% of the green certified buildings in New Zealand. It's an important step, and it's very easy to do better, to set some good targets to do better than green. Sustainable, a sort of neutral space in the middle, doing no harm, doing no good. But if I said to you, I had a sustainable relationship with my wife, you'd be a little bit concerned. You might suggest a bit of counseling, Jerome, or, going out and having a party and adding a bit of joie de vivre. It's not quite how, nature doesn't work by doing sums and adding up to zero. Nature actually is on a trajectory of increasing the conditions for life and ensuring that evolution continues. So then we get to restorative. And so that's us fixing up stuff. It's, the Hauraki Gulf is broken, let's fix it up. But that's still a headset of doing things to nature or to communities. I always feel a little frustrated with Auckland Council's consultation when they tell you what they're doing and they just like a nod of approval. So that leads us into this idea of regenerative design and development, where actually we behave like nature on this planet and we do things with nature for the benefit of both humans and people. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. So we need to be green, but actually we need to be regenerative at the same time, and really thinking about the health of our communities and the health of our ecosystems and all that means. So just a quick question. In your daily business, in your activities, in your life, are you arresting disorder? Are you stopping, are you just hanging in there and doing less harm? Are you complying? Are you adding value? Are you ensuring that your business is a healthy place to work and you're making a fair profit and your products and services look after people or add value to people? Doing good is about getting out and cleaning up your local stream, or actually offering products and services that help help other people do good stuff in the world. But regenerate life is where you actually get into the thinking about how nature and people live in a particular area and how they will take care of that and ensure that it's healthy. And in actual fact, we're working with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei on their master plan, and we're having some really interesting conversations about how do you live here in Auckland? How do you decouple from all the harm and ensure that you really take care of your people by taking care of the place? And so they've got a master plan that we're working on that will guide them over time, the way they build, the way they plant, the way they operate in that space. So most people, I think, probably at the adding value level, quite a few like doing some good, but we need to start thinking about what what it means to be a business that regenerates life. The Jasmax has done a lot of work on carbon. We used life cycle analysis. We modeled a range of built buildings, some that we had on the cards already, like AUT and the University of Auckland, 2 large projects. And we looked at operational energy, we looked at water use, and we looked at embodied carbon, the carbon to build a building. And it's often not included in the calculations for carbon neutrality, but buildings take and infrastructure like roads takes a huge amount of carbon to make them. So what we've essentially done, we've essentially said that if a typical building today uses around 180 kilowatt hours of energy per square meter of building per year, we've got a target of 2030 of using no more than 55 kilowatt hours. So that's almost a 2/3 reduction. It's about a 70% reduction in energy use. And you might think, well, that's pretty transformational, but actually many of our buildings, because we've been thinking about this and we've been working closely with our clients and our consultants, many of our buildings can achieve this already. And then that also leads on to the operational carbon. So that figure 3580, that's actually an international figure. We sometimes have to use international benchmarks, but you can see that New Zealand buildings are typically better than international. That's because we've got a renewable grid, but that we are, essentially over New Zealand's, we're targeting again around a 50% saving in operational carbon and roughly a 50% saving in embodied carbon. And to achieve that embodied carbon, as Joey mentioned in the introduction, we need to be reusing our existing buildings. And that's what the University of Auckland project is, and also the AUT project. They reuse the concrete frame and structure of the existing building. If it's not that, it needs to use a timber structure, like a mass timber for the columns, the beams, the supporting walls. Or you can do it by working through all the other elements of the building, but it's very difficult and it's much more challenging. So it kind of starts to guide our thinking. So a few years back, we were introduced to the Living Building Challenge, and it asks a different question to build green building. I call it the gateway to regenerative development and systems thinking. What if our buildings harvested all their energy and water from the site and the climate and adapted to the climate and the site? What if they operate pollution-free? They're comprised of integrated systems, like it works like a Swiss watch, and it's beautiful. So that's quite an aspirational and inspiring kind of premise to work to. And I won't go into too much detail, but it does ask us to really look at regenerating the ecology on the site, to grow food, to offset the land that's used for the building, and buy some conservation estate, cut your water usage by 70%, and then collect it all on site and treat that wastewater before you issue it from the site. Massive energy and carbon reductions. In fact, run your building on the renewable energy available from your roof. Super healthy, getting rid of toxic chemicals out of the interior, ensuring people have views and access to nature. Really vetting your materials to make sure that they're healthy, that they don't contain any toxic chemicals. Sourcing local, getting rid of waste, making sure your building's accessible and there's social equity built into it, and of course, beautiful and inspiring. So the first project I want to show you is not built. It was a competition for Christchurch after the earthquake, but it's a great example of lots of really good people working together and looking to create a new model of how we might live in our cities. And so what you're looking at there is mixed use. So there are apartments, there are some live work spaces, there's some commercial space and some retail space. There's also terraced houses and of varying sizes, from sort of 2 beds to 3 beds, right up to 5 beds. We worked with the Quakers. We worked with a charity for single homeless men. So there's some studio flats. The L shape in the middle is a community hall. the Quakers, but we use as a community space during the week. And so it's sort of an exemplar, and we use the Living Building Challenge as a framework to sort of guide our thinking and our response. You can see the whole roof is covered in solar panels, and that's debatable in New Zealand if we should do that with our, especially down south with our nearly renewable grid. C was a large wetland. This is a particular feature I liked. So all the sewage treatment, the black water, was treated in a technical system on site, and that effluent, without smell, was treated through a wetland that actually cleans the water up to standard that can be put into a stream. And then we ran it as a stream right the way through the site. So the public could walk through the site and then actually have a walk by the side of the stream as they traverse the site. A lot of vegetable beds and orchards and gardens in there, and really designed to, one of our biggest challenges in society is mental health. And there are many, many drivers for poor mental health in New Zealand today. But the design of this sort of 90-unit model development, if you like, was to really encourage good mental health and allow you to meet your neighbours and to interact with them and see them different levels. It might just be a hi or a nod, or actually meet them in the cafe and have coffee or whatever. But that was a big driver of the design. And obviously the thing that was given up to create all this green space and community space was that there's only a quarter of a car park per apartment, and half of those were car share. So we've driven the car out of our housing area and put community at the centre of it. This is another Christchurch project. This one is built. This was the Architecture and Engineering School for the Ara Institute. And it's called Kahukura, which means sort of chiefly cloak. And that's kind of what you're looking at there, a beautiful a facade inspired by a Maori chief's cloak, the holder of knowledge and wisdom. And this was before we were doing life cycle analysis and modeling, but what you can see here is a building that's predominantly timber structure. It has a small amount of services to drive air to the labs, but the sunny side is actually operable windows, and it's naturally ventilated up to the atrium in the middle, where in wintertime they can recover the heat from the stale air. Lots of natural light, a really beautiful biophilic space, which uses all the timber to sort of reconnect us to nature. Excuse me. So really beautiful building. And if you are in Christchurch in the medium future, it's open. It's really worth going to have a look at. So this is Ngāi Tūhoi's Kura Whare, or living building, or tong, a precious building. And this was an exceptional project to be able to work on. As I mentioned, Ivan Mercet was the lead architect. And just a series of sort of, if you like, planetary alignments. Tūhoi wanted the building. They were very keen on a deep sustainability engagement. And the author of the Living Building Challenge was here in New Zealand at the time, and he came over. We did some training, and Tūhoi were interested. And they were like, well, we don't really need your standard, but it'll be a useful framework to help guide us. And so it became a wonderful conversation. What you're looking at there in this image is the tribal chamber, and in the background, the two-story building is their office. Now, just you remember the figure of 55 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for a typical office or tertiary building as a goal. This office building uses 37 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So it's incredibly efficient, runs on natural ventilation, and captures the sun to warm it in wintertime, and has some concrete floors that cool it in summertime. It's predominantly timber. It's got timber foundations, piles in the ground. It's got timber structure, timber cladding, and a lot of the finishing is in timber. But it also includes 5,000 earth bricks that were made by the community and by Ngāi Tūhoi people. They collected earth from 6 areas of the Tūhoi Rohe and trained 20 people. and then 200 volunteers contributed to making these bricks. And they become part of the passive air conditioning system for the library, the offices, the meeting rooms, because they absorb moisture if it's damp, and they absorb heat if it's too hot, and then release it in the reverse. They all have little signs and names on them. This is the roof. This building generates all the energy that it needs, and it actually is their civil defense HQ as well. So it has batteries and can operate when it's not, you know, if the grid goes down. Brief for about 6 months, it was the biggest solar electric array in New Zealand. And this is the botanical wetland. So you might be familiar with a septic tank system. So it's kind of like a passive septic tank, and then the effluent flows out into these planted gravel beds, and the plants basically eat the nutrients and the bacteria. And after about 10 days in here, the water is up to drinking water quality. A little bit earthy tasting, but and then just a bit of an overview. You can see the tribal chamber on the right and the offices on the left, and there's a cafe in the middle. This building's typically open during the week, and you can see the aerial view of the solar array and also the entrance foyer on the bottom right. So it's a really delightful building. Tūhoe call themselves children of the mist. They lived in the te rawiras. The forests are their sort of the mother. And so this building represents that connection to the land. And this building has been certified. And so one of the things we have to do is actually calculate the operational and the embodied carbon for a 100-year life, and then buy offsets for that. So it's actually a zero carbon building for 100 years, which is a pretty phenomenal. What was really interesting though was seeing that it, you know, I mentioned earlier that this conversation is more about buildings, and what we learned from Tūhoe is that they were using the design and the construction of the building to regenerate their spirit and their well-being. And they employed hundreds of Tūhoe people to build it. They collected timber from the forests, earth from the Roe. 70% of the spend on this building was within a 100-kilometer radius of the building itself. So using local subcontractors and stimulating the local economy. And really, the building is a sort of an expression of their relationship with the land. And that's kind of how they see it. And that's what we were learning as we worked with them. Another thing that we did, we had to vet between the contractor, the engineers, and ourselves, 750 materials. And we had to get a signed statement from the suppliers confirming that there were no toxic chemicals, no worst-in-class red list toxic chemicals. And as a result of that, those 750 conversations, about a year's worth of work, basically, for a person, that sent a pulse of awareness through our industry in New Zealand. And you'll find that our industry is very well sort of versed in what shouldn't be in products. And also many New Zealand manufacturers have what's called a declare label, which is sort of like a basic grade eco label that confirms that it's like a food ingredients label for building products, and it confirms that they don't have red list chemicals. So not only did it transform Tūhoe, the building, but it actually helped transform our industry and raise this awareness. And now there's a lot more effort put into non-toxic buildings and building products. So this is a design slide. This is a rooftop farm. This is a farm on a shopping centre just outside Melbourne. And it is now, it's on its way to being fully certified as a living building. You can see that there are solar panels on the roof, there are gardening beds. They take all the organic waste from the leases and they compost it, and they use it in the farm. They run cooking courses, they have a cafe there using the ingredients. And, you know, I'm not a big supermarket shopping center guy, but I could go and hang out on the roof, have my coffee, enjoy myself. And, you know, there's a place for everybody. Now, you might say, oh my God, this is going to cost a lot of money. And why would anybody, you know, contemplate this? But what the actuaries who calculate rental returns actually understood was this being such a green or even a living building shopping centre. It's going to attract a lot more trade. There will be more traffic. And they estimated, COVID clause excluded, that foot traffic would be 10% higher than a typical shopping mall. And so the rents are actually 10% higher on this development. They made a great effort to incorporate Indigenous culture. And you can see there is a Woolworths, which is our countdown. Now they have a generic standard specification for their buildings. There are a lot of toxic chemicals. There are a lot of long conversations. That Woolworths runs on daylight, solar power, and has no toxic chemicals in it. So even, when we sit down and we have these conversations, we can even move large corporate entities to think differently and to engage differently. And that's a shot of the farm. A little bit sad. That is a COVID, we know that Melbourne had the longest lockdown ever. So the gardener's in there, but nobody else in that photo. Closer to home, this is Aroha, 26 Aroha Ave, a very dedicated husband and wife client team wanting to contribute to solving the climate crisis, the housing crisis, and that, remember what I said about mental health. And so we worked very closely with them for over 3 years, designing this new apartment building. That big mass in the background, 200 meters away, is the car park and St. Luke's shopping centre. So Aroha is 14, 15 apartments, a little bit of workspace. There are 2 car parks for the whole complex, and they are for car share. There's a big bike park and scooter park and pram park downstairs. It runs on a little bit of, you can just see on the red block at the back some solar on the roof, and then on the front white block, there are large solar hot water panels. So all the hot water for the building is collected through those panels and stored in 2 large cylinders and circulated around the building. And there's a little bit of solar electric to run the lift and the pumps and the common areas. It has this wonderful rooftop terrace, and anybody can go up there, and that's actually where the laundry is. So nobody has a washing machine or a dryer in their apartment. They go upstairs and they can hang out, have coffee, read the paper, have a barbecue, whatever, get the washing done. Interestingly, that's 3 dryers and 3 washing machines compared to 14, which we typically put into 14 apartments. Just really starting to look at how do we share resources, how do we look after each other. We have our own private space, but we have some shared public space. And then bottom left is a little snapshot of the apartment. It's a great website, 26 Aroha. If you Google that, you can have a look at this online. But they have 1 grid connection, they have 1 Wi-Fi connection, 1 water connection, and the Body Corp does all the billing. It costs you about half the monthly bills to live here than it does a typical apartment or house in Auckland, because of those shared resources, and the Body Corp does the billing. It's all sort of automated. You get your rental bill each month, and you get your energy and your laundry dryers. You don't pay for the wash, you pay for the dryer. And if you've used they have a little shared guest room. So instead of having 4 rooms, you can have 3 rooms in your apartment. There's a guest room if granny turns up or whatever. So life is complex, not complicated. The image on the left is a what I would call a mechanical or a linear response to a challenge of moving water from A to B. It's a concrete channel, it's a gully, it's actually running through a reserve or park, and it's designed to move water from A to B as quickly as possible. That also, in the time of climate heating, that also causes many, many problems. Flooding is accelerated, stormwater sweeps through, carries silt, carries rubbish, and the water then carries on down to the next stage of the water system, depositing silt, often at harbour mouths and things like that. And silt in the water is really bad for marine ecology. That image on the right-hand side is the same stream, regenerated, redesigned. The concrete's been taken out. They've added back the stones. They've slowed down the flow. They recreated an ecological system. And let alone the fact that it's an insect breeding ground and that wildflowers and plants can grow there. The flood mitigation, the water flows slowed down. That means the silt is deposited in the stream. And what a lovely place to cycle or walk alongside of and actually regenerate our mental health too. So this is all about intentions. It's all about what we want to achieve. I can do your conventional building, or Jasmax can design your conventional building. We can design you a conventional green building. But if at the beginning of that project, we say, what is the potential of this building to create stronger relationships with nature, with the community, to actually meet wider needs? It's not necessarily an increase in cost. It's not necessarily an increase in responsibility, but we can actually come up with very, very different outcomes. So how we think about our business, how we think about our buildings, how we think about the quality of our relationships, if we can be intentional and whole and tend to generate some health and well-being from those, it's a real opportunity. And I'm just going to share, we're nearly done now. I think, just give me a couple more minutes and I'll stop talking and take some questions. So I'm just going to give you, this is actually, Battleborough is a little town on the northeastern seaboard. And you can see to the right is the coast. You can see the road network. You can see networks of little bit areas of forestry, and the light green is farmland. You can see the town bypass, the black line is bypass. When the town was founded, perfect. You're on a river estuary, lots of silt, fertile soils. You've got sea transport. You've got fresh water, vaguely defensive. You know, you can control yourself. So great place to form a settlement. And right up until the Second World War, people would have been, you know, if the farms were productive and people would be growing veggies in their garden and walking and, you know, generally strong community, concentrated town. After the Second World War, population growth, developments, and more infrastructure, gardens get infilled with more houses, the town spreads out, farming systems change, more pesticides, more fertilizer. So the brief was a local food co-op. They wanted a new building, and they'd asked my colleague Bill Reed, an architect at the time, you know, we want a green star or a LEED accredited building. What can you do? And so they went up to visit. They took a walk through the store, and they were looking at the produce, and it's like, oh, avocados from Mexico. Oh, grapes from Chile. Oh, apples from New Zealand. Tofu from Burma. It was all imported food. And in actual fact, the fundamental of the store was that if there was a trucking strike, they'd be out of business in a couple of days. So Bill said to them, okay, let's expand our thinking. Let's have a look at the network. And so what you're looking at is sort of the map that they considered. And they went out and they talked to some of the farmers. The farms were degraded from the use of fertilizers, pesticides. The farmers were old. The land values had increased massively. So there were all these barriers to young farmers engaging and taking over the farms. So the report Bill wrote back was, yes, you can have a green building, of course you can, but actually your stock and your relationship with the land and the farming community is completely broken. And if you regenerate that, and what does it mean to regenerate it? It means coming up with solutions that would allow young farmers to come in onto the farms and start organically farming the land, returning it back to its fertility, and finding ways, you know, like rent to lease to buy, or shared ownership and things like that, that would open up and allow the transference of value, but also regenerate the farming system so they could feed back into the and actually the design of the building changed. It became much more of a marketplace. It included a home kill butchery and childcare. So it did influence the brief and the final design of the building, but they got their green building and the clients got to work on regenerating the farming system. But we often say the project is not the project. You must look at the system that the project's nested in and understand that there are relationships between the site, especially through water. The way water is a great vector for joining up the system, but typically a business or a building's nested in its neighborhood, Parnell, nested in the bigger city. There's a whole water sort of catchment and network running through that. There's a biodiversity of the whole region. And we can start to think about how our buildings can not only be green, but they can help to regenerate the health of our waterways and our harbours. And I'm really pleased to say that clients are starting to take this on board and engage with this. And there are opportunities for businesses to engage with their community and work on some of these deep fundamental issues around our health and well-being. And I know the Parnell Business Association does some of this around waste and things. So I would just encourage much more of it, because actually creating a healthy and thriving neighborhood within its sort of local ecology is actually the thing that will sustain us over time. So I'd encourage all of you to reflect and think about how can we build better relationships? How can we work better together and be in service to our community and to our local ecology? I'd just like to highlight that there's a sort of a social enterprise started. We had our first event last night. It's called Whakaora, which means to heal, to work on the whole. And it's really focused on creating a thriving city, using some of the systems thinking. AUT are in the mix, some of the building products people are there. Have a look at the website, ourthrivingcity.co.nz. We've actually got an event at the end of November, which is a sort of an interactive event and would be as good for building professionals as for business people to start helping you understand how to use systems thinking. Here's my obligatory cartoon, which I think does say it really, really well. Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. You know, that's the COVID wave, the threat of recession hanging over us, climate change, but sitting behind climate change is biodiversity collapse. And we start to understand that our real challenges are systemic, and we need to have systemic responses to them. Just dealing with one or the other is, you know, it's like the frog game, the pop-up frogs. You hit one, the next one pops up. So let's change our thinking. Let's take a more systemic approach and have a think about your role. What would it look like if we were really working closely, like in a joint venture with nature? So kia ora, kapai, thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jerome. That was excellent, really interesting, and
Amazing.
Jasmax have really pushed this agenda right from the start. It's very much the DNA of Jasmax, and it comes through in your projects. And I love the Tūhoi example with the community making the bricks from their own land. I think that's great. And I will have a look at 26 Araha. I had a quick question before we open the floor, with particularly in 26 Araha is a great example of where people can actually, we don't all have to have a washing machine and a dryer, you know, this sort of shared community resources and this sort of those shared spaces, that's going to take quite a bit of change of habits for people. And often people hang back a bit and are sort of not so keen to really change their habits, whether it's in their business or their own lifestyle. So how do we sort of get that shift, do you think, for people to think we can do this, we can live and operate differently?
Look, well, that's a good question, Joey. It's a mixture of things. I noticed earlier that Prue Fear is online, and she's actually was the lead architect on the project. And I think it's around, so for instance, the central stairway, front doors face each other. We've actually done as much as we can in the design to sort of set up those bump spaces and relationships. And then the kitchen, the top floor roof deck is pretty cool. It is a draw. You get these incredible views, and the washing machines are there to draw you up there. And so I think it's a little bit, you know, behavior change probably happens over time, and we do change when we look back. You know, when I first met Auckland in early 90s, there were many less fences up between houses. They've all gone up in the meantime, you know, so we do change over time. So I think it's just reminding ourselves as drivers and why we want this and what the value of it is, and encouraging people. And a good working example like 26 Araha will sort of influence other projects as well. But I think we actually have a really deep, strong need to be connected to other people. And sometimes just seeing the same person in the street every day is actually enough to satisfy that. But Kiwis, you know, we're pretty talkative. We like catching up. We like meeting. So I don't think we'll have any major problems. If we provide the infrastructure, I think people will come.
Great, great. We've had a question through on the chat from Matt Ball. Hi there, my question is about cost. Can you build regenerative buildings for the same or less than a bog standard buildings? Is there any inherent higher costs?
So my teacher for systems thinking is a guy called Bill Reed. And I got to say, he's a real raconteur. He has some great stories. And one of the stories he says is that when he was a young architecture student on the East Coast of America, he had a girlfriend on the West Coast, you know, 4,000 miles away. And he had no money as a student. And he said it was remarkable how many weekends he was on the West Coast. Where there's a will, there's a way. And that's around our intentions. Now, so there's a few parts to the answer, one of which is we have, like I mentioned earlier, we've definitely changed in as much as, you know, 5-10 years ago, we really were focused. The buildings we were building were pretty bad. I mean, there's a building at Manukau Hospital that's being reclad now that's less than 10 years old. That is appalling. That is where we focus all our attention on cost, and we cut costs at the expense of everything else. And that sort of became the norm in New Zealand. That is, you know, and that then sets the budget for everything else. That is a disaster. All the reclads, all the buildings around Auckland that were leaky, that are covered in white plastic while they get a reclad. That is where we drive everything from a cost perspective. So secondly, we've been a little slow on the uptake, but there is a process called integrated design, where rather than a sort of slow linear evolution of the design, we put everything on the table up front. Engineers, architects, project managers, everybody co-designs it, and we run through lots of iterations very quickly. And we set some goals, and we say, what would it take to get to 80% energy efficiency? And what we find, those step changes, you know, the halfway changes, the small changes actually cost more than the step changes. So if we do a really good, I can design new homes in Auckland that don't need any heating or cooling. So I've saved the money on the chiller, the heater, and replacing that in 15 years' time by having good ventilation systems and a good insulated envelope. So we can find these optimizations. And actually, if we do that process, we can deliver deep green, high-performing buildings for cheaper than normal buildings. And I didn't show it, but the Waste Management Office in Springs Road is an example of that. Yeah. And that building, when the judges for the awards went round, they were like, well, what would you change? And they were like, nothing. It's exactly what we wanted. And that building is incredibly efficient. It's got a 100-year life, and it took out all the green building awards and the top property council awards. And it really included the stakeholders in the process. So they co-designed it too. So they got what they wanted. So cost is an issue. Cost is an issue when you just keep adding stuff to the design, trying to make it better. So even a systems approach at the building level is a really cost-effective way. And when we expand it up to regeneration and we start to use it to stimulate the health of the environment, well, then instead of ignoring all those external costs and not paying them, we're actually doing the opposite. We're building health in the system as well. So better process, better thinking, and the cost question falls away.
Great, thank you. We've just got one more quick question from Bridget, if that's okay, Cheryl. Yeah. Bridget's interested in the Burwood project, which was amazing. And how's refrigerant considered for the likes of Woolworths within the Living Building Challenge framework? Because we know refrigerants are incredibly potent greenhouse gas emissions.
So here's me, Mr. Systems Thinker, but let's dive down into the atoms that make up refrigerants. So the best refrigerants, the R22 refrigerants that we have available and are pretty common today, and not everybody uses them, but they are pretty much becoming the norm. They have a global warming potential of 2,000 times a carbon dioxide molecule. And we were really shocked. So Jasmax has been monitoring its carbon and its footprint for 10 years now. And about 3 years ago, you know, carbon equals money. We go through all the financials and, you know, travel, flights, everything, and that all equates to carbon. That's how we work it out. And there was this receipt from the services engine, you know, the building services engineers. It was a $2,000 or something. And our less than 10-year-old plant had been leaking refrigerant, and bang, suddenly it was a third of our carbon footprint for the year. We couldn't believe it. It really gave us the focus on refrigerant. So not only are they bad, but they leak, especially if you buy cheaper equipment, they leak out. So as I said earlier, a really good, well-designed home that doesn't need a split system air conditioning unit won't be leaking refrigerant in 15 years time, because we haven't even got one there. So that's a bonus. Eliminate it and design them out, number one. If you do need to use them because you've got a big sort of air, you know, sealed office building or a hospital, or all the fridges in a supermarket, then you've got to think very carefully. So number one, efficiency. They had not only doors on the fridges, sorry, on the freezers, but they put doors on all the fridges in that supermarket, reducing their need for refrigeration. All the waste heaters were covered, and they use better quality equipment. But what has just emerged, as one would expect from Europe and especially from Germany, I've just been looking at a new kind of heat pump that is more efficient than the standard ones and uses a gas, a natural gas called pentane as the refrigerant, and it has a global warming potential of 1, the same as carbon dioxide. So they, and they've got a longer life. It's a company that used to make gas boilers, but now they make electrically run heat pumps. And I've seen it, Kahukura was looking at a system of a large heat pump it was an apartment building of 36 apartments. They compared putting a standard electric cylinder into every apartment. So that's just straight electric hot water heating. One of these heat pumps supplying hot water to 2 1,000-litre tanks and then piping it to 36 apartments, run from solar on the roof. The cost was $10,000 extra to do the heat pump for 36 units. So it's about $300 extra a unit. I can't do the math, $350 a unit. And that ran, it had no hot water costs. Wow. So the solar ran the heat pump, provided the hot water, distributed to the apartments. And for the life of the solar panels, 35 years was not going to incur a bill for heating hot water in that apartment.
Right.
For 10,000
we've got solutions coming.
Zero carbon and zero global warming potential from the refrigerant. So there is, tech is helping us, but we can go a lot further with the help of that good tech. Yeah. So
awesome. Awesome. We'll have to cut it there. I think we could carry on, but we need to cut the time. But thanks so much, Jerome, and for your time. That was really awesome. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Jerome. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, Cheryl and Joey and Abby for setting up.
Welcome.
Too.
And
guys, just to let you know that this recording will be on our website, and Abby will send the link to all of those who RSVP'd. So if you do want to share it on with other people, please do so.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.